Uh, Thank you. So, hi everyone. My name's Alex. I'll be um with you guys today, and I'll be talking about rebuttals. So it's okay if you guys don't have your cams on. But if you guys have, so I know I'm not alone. That would be really great. So, next slide, please. So before I just begin, I just want to make a few caveats that I want people to keep in mind when listening to this lecture that will not be too long. The first is that this is not exhaustive. So I think that there are so many ways for you to build rebuttals, and I think Clarice hinted that responses aren't just with rebuttals. So I highly encourage you guys to really explore different workshops, different debates, and to also experiment on your own, given that, as I've also mentioned here, rebuttals are up to personal style, and there's really a different way of making rebuttals. As long as you are able to get the point across and it's clear for you, I think it should work. The second is I credit to a lot of what I'm about to discuss to coaches, alumni, workshops, and also my personal experience in debate. So that's why I encourage you guys to try it on your own. So I think that's mostly all of that. The way that we'll talk about rebuttals, next slide please, will be on outline. First we'll just describe what a rebuttal is. Second, how to structure rebuttals. Thirdly, some elements of a rebuttal. And lastly, some tips on making rebuttals. All right, so let's go to the first one. Next slide, please. So what are rebuttals? Next slide. So actually, rebuttals are arguments. A lot of people think that arguments and rebuttals are two separate things, but they're not. You build them the same way. I think that there was an argumentation lecture, like building arguments lecture given earlier, the past session. And it's still the same thing where you have to give a premise, give an analysis, give impacts. But the difference is rebuttals are arguments that disprove other arguments. So for example, if Gov runs why a certain policy is justified, like principally justified, if opposition runs, it's unjustified, then clearly they're clashing with each other. So the way that rebuttals make your team win is that compared to arguments where they are able to explain points, ideas, why certain impacts and things are important, they make your team win by making the other team less credible because you're, in general, saying that their ideas are not true or they're not important. I think a good way that one of my alums or one of the debaters I look up into, and they were also from the ADS when I was still in high school, is to treat it like a tower. So imagine that um, OG, let's say it's BP, your OO, in the team with OG will build their arguments and consider that the way that they build it is how they build their tower. Rebuttals are like wrecking balls or people who are in a demolition squad. And essentially what you do is that you lessen the tower by redestroying the points. At the end of the debates, even if both teams build their arguments well, um, it's rebuttals help judges compare by seeing which towers are shorter. Yeah. So I think that's like a good illustration with how it differs when you compare rebuttals to arguments. Arguments are building or positive contributions. Rebuttals are negative contributions. And they generally help you win by making other teams lose material that allows the judge to credit. The last thing is, and I think I mentioned this earlier, is that rebuttals introduce clashes in the debate. Because we established that rebuttals are also arguments in and of themselves, the flip of an argument can function as a rebuttal. So for example, if OG is arguing that a certain policy is beneficial for a group of people, and OO argues the flip side, it's actually harmful for these minorities. These rebuttals clash with each other. So this is how you know that you are within the scope of their debate, like if your arguments do clash with each other. And that's what rebuttals help you do. All right. So in general, that's how we would define rebuttals. first as arguments, and secondly as ideas that generally clash in the round. Next slide, please. So how do you usually structure rebuttals? And I'd preface this by saying that it's important to know how rebuttals are structured so that you know where to place rebuttals. So there are generally two ways that rebuttals are structured. First is explicitly or extraneously. Secondly is that they're integrated. Um, on the first one, I think it's more appropriate to say they're extraneous because integrated rebuttals have to be explicit anyway. But I'd say it's explicit in the sense that the rebuttal portion of your speech has its own section dedicated for just rebuttals. So extraneous rebuttals are generally rebuttals that are separate from your main arguments, as the word suggests, and you usually use them when the rebuttals that you have are separate from either your arguments if you're opening or your extension for if you are closing. If it's integrated, it's the flip side. So they're included in your main arguments and you use them when your arguments directly clash with each other. I think it's important to note that it is with integrated rebuttals that you have to signpost what the rebuttal is responding to. So for example, if you're running an extension and you think that like people usually signpost, my rebuttals will be integrated in my extension. You're running your extension, not all of them will respond to the speaker before you. So you have to signpost, okay, this part of my extension responds to the speaker before me. Always do that. So it helps the judge track. And it also it explains to the judge that you're actually responding to the speaker before you and not that you just said it on the top of your speech just so that you can escape your burden as a team to respond. So in debates though, you don't have to choose between the two. Like there are some rebuttals that will have to be explicit. And there's some rebuttals that will have to be integrated. Um, it's up to you and it's up to your personal preference. I think there are different considerations that speaker use. So the first being um, in terms of like what saves them more time. Second, so how it organizes well with the rest of your case. And thirdly, I think, and we'll explore this more later when I talk about tips, speaker positions. So I'll explain that more later. But I think in general, this is how rebuttals are structured. You would know when where a rebuttal is if teams, because teams are supposed to signpost it. But in cases where they aren't, and you're dealing with a team that integrates a lot, then it becomes your job to pinpoint what points are also functioning as rebuttals while also functioning as constructive extensions or arguments. So yeah. Next slide, please. So now we'll go to the elements of a rebuttal. The old structure that I was taught of is first step is disproving the truth value, why it's not true. And then secondly, even if it's not true, um, there are reasons why this argument should not be credited. So other metrics that aren't just challenging the truth value, which also challenges the likelihood, the scale, or prerequisite, like one comes before the other. In this lecture, they are segmented more specifically, and the intent is just to be more specific, and hopefully this helps you guys guide more. But again, feel free to experiment on your own and have your own way of segregating your rebuttals or classifying them. The first two generally deals with the rebuttal of the truth value part. So for step one is rebutting the premise. So the overall claim of the argument is not true. The second is you rebut the analysis. So maybe the claim is true, but then it doesn't lead to the impacts or the outcomes that the other side wants. A good thing to note here is when you're trying to rebut the analysis, you don't just have the opportunity to say that it's untrue. You actually have an opportunity to explain that you claim a harm, it can lead to a harm. So it means that the other side is actually net negative. This is different. Because again, let's talk about a tower, right? Like if you prove that the tower doesn't exist, that's different from proving that actually they don't have a tower, they have a pit, they have a hole. And that's their case. So that's why it's important to distinguish if when you're rebutting analysis, if you're simply going to neutralize it, or you can actually explain that the other side has it worse. The third is you can rebut the impact. So this portion, step 3 and 4, are mostly on even ifs, and the third step is mitigation. So you explain that the impact is not as large as the other side explained it. And lastly, on rebutting the importance. So this is where you assume the premise is true, the analysis is true. That means that, okay, point A leads to point B outcome or benefits, and the impact that gov or your opposing side claims um is is something that affects the target group of people that they said it does affect. You can directly compare the arguments and explain why they're less important than your argument. Is it about likelihood? Is it about scale? Is it about prerequisite? Like maybe your argument comes before their argument. And again, an important thing to note that each of these things function as layers of even ifs already. So the premise is not true. Even if the premise is true, the analysis is not true, or the analysis actually leads to more harms. Even if the analysis is true, the impact is not as big. Even if the impact is large, it is smaller compared to the impacts of our argument, or just unlikely compared to our argument, or our argument comes before theirs. So this makes more sense when we do the practice. But it's very important to note that these are ways that rebuttals form and rebuttals can work. So next slide, please. So we'll go to an exercise. I think I asked a request from Orcom here. And the way that we can do this exercise is I will have a motion and there is an argument. And I'd like all speakers to try giving their own rebuttals. So it can be any of the four that I flashed earlier. So it can be rebutting the premise, rebutting the analysis itself, rebutting the impacts, or providing even ifs. And then I'll try to explain, or let's try to explore what is the strength and weakness of each point. Um, yeah. So yes, the recording is paused so that all of you guys don't have to be shy, and then give it to everyone so that everyone can also give everyone can also see your ideas. And if you have the same rebuttal or same ideas, don't be shy. We'll prioritize the ones that most people have in common or have in mind. All right. So go to the next slide, please. So there's an info slide to this motion actually. Just in terms, like just in case you guys need more clarification. Next slide, please, Clars. Also, we're still recording.
Oh, oh my gosh. Sorry. I paused the screen share, not the recording.
That's okay.
Oh, wait. Okay. Sorry, guys.
There are other rebuttals, I think you guys sent some responses, but I'll just go quickly. First is washing and symmetricizing. So this just generally points out that the harm or benefit happens on either side. The reason why they might not be the most strategic is because no one wins. Like again, if you explain that harm exists on either side, benefit exists on either side, that just explains that both you and your opponent are on equal grounds. But the aim of rebuttals is to make you win. So that's why I would say deprioritize this unless you have no other rebuttals at all. Secondly, in contradiction. So contradiction is when your opponent rebuts themselves because their second argument might rebut their first argument. What you want to do is that you want to explain what the contradiction does for the speaker case. So either they have to defend the first argument or the second argument. They can't claim both because both of them neutralize each other. Last are technical rebuttals. So these are just rebuttals that criticize the argument. You point out that they're assertive or unproven, but it's actually good to engage anyway. That's why, again, assume that they actually built their argument, assume they have a premise, they assume they have the analysis, and they assume that they have the impact. Explain why these things are not true. So yeah, just to cap it all off. In summary, next slide, please. The metric to having a good rebuttals is firstly that they're universal, so they apply broadly, not just to specific examples or contexts. So if you so on our exercise, right, the types of mechanistic or premise rebuttals that we try to give are ones that apply to all contexts. Secondly, they are exclusive, so make sure that these rebuttals do not undermine your case. The problem with it happens on either side or running symmetricizing rebuttals is that they're not exclusive. So they don't clearly explain why judges should give you the win. And connected to this, exclusivity clearly differentiates you and your opponent and the quality of your arguments. Lastly is you want to prioritize rebuttals that affects the opponent's case more. So this is where I want to insert example rebuttals. So maybe your opponent might have weird examples, but it's actually good to rebut the logic behind the example and not just the example itself. Because if you just rebut the example, they say, okay, this is a specific case, but in the broader amount of cases, our argument still stands. So yeah. Next slide, please. So this portion will just dedicate to tips on making good rebuttals. So I think before the round, in like any other argument, you can prep rebuttals, but do not be too reliant with them. I think a good litmus test in prepping rebuttals is that if they are intuitive, chances are they are either first speaker or first layer responses. And the reason why you don't want to prep your rebuttals too much is because your rebuttals should be interactive. Like they should respond to an argument that is made by another team. If you're OG and you want to do preemptions, same thing applies. You want to limit your preemptions because your preemptions only work if the opposing team runs what's the expected case. If they don't, it might be a bit risky for your side. When you're in round, in terms of selecting rebuttals, so the first is, are they speaker specific? For example, you want to rebut a model or you want to challenge a frame. That should be done at first speaker. If it's an argument provided by the speaker before you, you should prioritize that compared to other arguments in the round. And you also want to prioritize in terms of how dangerous they are for your side. So generally, arguments that directly clash with your argument should go first compared to ones that like don't really clash. Like for example, they argue the principle, you argue pragmatic. Um, you can you always have to prioritize the pragmatic rebuttals and vice versa because the principled argumentation doesn't really threaten the pragmatic arguments unless the speaker explains why. Secondly, beware of preemptions of the opposing team. So sometimes teams might prepare for your rebuttals. Preemptions are generally rebuttals to your rebuttals. So if they have preemptions, listen to them, and respond to them first. Thirdly and fourthly, signposts. Always signpost your rebuttals, especially if they're integrated. As I mentioned earlier, if they're integrated rebuttals, you want it to be easy to the judge to find and credit your rebuttals and explain what the rebuttal means for their case. So if you rebut their premise, this means that their impacts and mechanisms do not stand because they're all reliant on the central claim that the team makes. Or if their argument is just not as important compared to your argument, it just means that in the best case where you disregard all of the other rebuttals, our argument in terms of whatever metric you place, this stand. So always explain what your rebuttal does to your speech. Yeah. Next slide, please. So very quickly on responsive POIs and improving rebuttals. Some people like to integrate rebuttals in their POIs. Aside from you want to make it short, if the rebuttal is that important, I would heavily discourage launching it as a POI because again, rebuttals are like arguments and that they take time to build, especially if they're large ones. So always integrate them in your case, whether it be explicitly or you integrate them in your extension. How to improve on rebuttals? First is that there is a lot of cross-related skills. So argument construction helps you become a better rebuttal speaker. Tracking the debate also matters. If you want to put it in practice, one-on-one spars, because full rounds consume a lot of time, but they also help you. You also want a case build based on recorded debates. So maybe prep a motion that has a recorded debate, listen to the prime minister, and then do the LO speech right after, and then compare your LO speech to the other LO speech and why they ran those rebuttals, which is an advice also given to me by older debaters, and I think it was helpful. And then lastly, especially, and this applies on matter-specific debates, try to matter load. Like, the truth value of some arguments are just dependent on facts. So if you're able to know how basic NGOs, institutions, financial instruments, like very knowledge specific debates, having matter is a very good way of knowing how to rebut specific arguments, especially if the opposing team is not as matter loaded as you are. So yeah, I think that those are mostly tips and advice on making rebuttals. It's not as extensive again because I think a lot of them are based on how you practice, and they're really specific with how you develop your own rebuttal style when you develop how you debate in general. So yeah. Next slide, please. So yeah, I'll now open to Q&A. If you
Yeah.
have any questions.
So if you guys have any questions for Alex, you can either PM her directly, or if you're shy, you can PM the ADS Zoom account, and I will read the question to Alex, and I won't say your name.
Oh, Clarence, I think you can pause the recording at this point as well.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Thank you for not leaving after Rebuttals, a more relevant lecture. The joke lang, just kidding. My lecture is very important. It's very, very important. Okay, so today we'll be talking as comprehensively as possible about weighing material. Basically, the next step after you've gotten responses to other teams out of the way. Quick outline, very simple. What is weighing? Why weigh? And I think this is important because people don't do it often enough. When in the debate or when in your speech should you weigh? And then we'll talk about how with a quick exercise so that there's interactivity. And then you can ask questions either before or after the exercise based on what you learned from it. So what is weighing? Seems simple enough, right? You compare why one piece of material is more important than another. But this is an important distinction because I think people don't know the difference between impacting and weighing anymore. So, or they substitute impacting for weighing by just doing impacting and packaging it as weighing. So, for example, by saying our argument is more important than their argument because, and then you say the impacts that your prime minister said all over again. That is not weighing. Okay, you need to prove with an additional layer of analysis why one piece of material is more important than another. And I want to note here that it's not just limited to arguments. You don't just have to weigh arguments or weigh issues. Like if you're a whip, you don't have to just weigh, oh, why is this issue more than the important than the other one? You can also weigh between different materials. Like you can weigh a rebuttal against an argument, and you can weigh an argument as inherently responsive or inherently disproving certain arguments or certain responses from a different side. This becomes especially important in British Parliament, where weighing is more important because to remain relevant in the round, your material should have a certain impact on the debate, right? British Parliament is judged by contribution to a debate. And so anything can be a relevant contribution if you explicitly say why. Okay. So even characterization, right? Like for example, closing government can win the debate purely on framing by saying, oh, if we are the first team to tell you why the OG argument is so important, And since OG is so completely devoid of impacting or weighing, don't engage enough on opening up, then by us giving the framing or characterization, even if it's just as simple as context, if you weigh it properly, that can be a debate winning extension. Okay. So I also want to make a distinction between content based weighing and meta based weighing. Content based weighing is proving that the content of the argument is more impactful by its sheer impact, right? Whereas meta-based weighing is when you make observations about the round, material should be credited, material that should not be credited, and therefore you can weigh your material as more important in relation to that other material. Okay, I think it's best understood with an example. A good example is, let's say you're weighing the argument where the impact is you save more lives, or you have another argument that where you uphold democracy better, or you have better representation, better choice versus saving more lives. The way you would weigh that based on content is by saying that saving lives is more important than democracy because it leads to XY this. Because lives are valuable versus XYZ. Because democracy is not that valuable relative because of XYZ. But an example of a meta-based weighing would be saying that saving lives is the saving lives argument is more important than the democracy argument, because based on how the round went, we proved the likelihood of saving lives more important. So basically, in content-based weighing, you're saying that democracy is more important than lives, or vice versa. With meta, you're not necessarily saying that democracy matters less, but you're making observations about the democracy argument that make your own argument more valuable. Is that clear? I hope that's clear. If you have questions in the middle of the lecture, by the way, you can just drop them in the chat, because I think clarifying these things early on is important. Okay. A few more things of misconceptions of weighing, especially in today's method that doesn't do it enough. A weighing is oftentimes assertive, right? So you just make an observation about your own argument, or you make a biased claim in of itself. Like, for example, you just intuition pump people's bias as to why democracy is more important than lives, for example. But in reality, you need to be a bit more technical about it, right? Like, for example, imagine if your judge just weighed different issues or clashes based on what they personally believe, or based on clear bias to one of the side's ideas. No, you need to be like justifying your weighing of your argument only in a biased way, right? Which is pretty much the job of a whip, right? Which is why a lot of weighing falls on whips. But I just want to say that all speakers should do weighing, and the way that they weigh should be the same level of discipline as a whip, right? You need to get into the weeds, take the other argument at its best case, assume that they really succeed in proving the other argument. And it is a valuable argument, right? So you concede that it is valuable, right? You don't just dismiss the importance of another argument, but you simply prove that, yes, important argument, but ours is more important. But lastly, as much as I've said that weighing is important, it's also not a silver bullet either. Because an easy way to sidestep weighing is, for example, Prime Minister talks so much, oh, this argument is so important, this value or this issue in the debate is so important. Then Leader of Opposition comes in and simply proves, yeah, we agree with all of that weighing. It's just that we will prove why we get that impact better, or we will just co-opt all their benefits. Okay, so that's an important distinction before we move further. Now, why weigh? I already touched on some of this, but basically, one, your arguments only matter to the motion. They can only be linked back to the motion if they are weighed properly. Okay, so an exaggerated way of saying this is simply that your arguments have zero relevance unless you weigh them, right? Or at least you impact them. And assuming that the other team is equally good at you at impacting or making an argument sound important, the argument only matters then, or it can only become debate winning when you market it as such. The second reason, and I think this is my reason why I weigh a lot, is because I'm hedging risk, right? For example, hedging risk against the closing team, right? You can demolish your open exchange or the first exchange, like the PMLO exchange, with responses, but your speech can only remain relevant through other speakers if you weigh, right? So, for example, yeah, you can win the opening debate, but if closing debate just uh, introduces new arguments that seem so important, they can win by recency bias or they can win because they weighed better than you, right? Like they made observations, not just proving arguments, but why an argument's more important. So you need to hedge risk, right? To remain relevant in debates, whether it's AP or BP, amongst later speakers. But secondly, you also have to hedge risk against judges who don't track material that well or who easily forget about an argument. Um, if you weigh an argument and make it so important within the debate, or prove why this value is what all other values or all other teams in the debate should compete to prove, then it's impossible for a bad judge to just ignore your material because um yeah because you explicitly make it relevant within the round, and so it doesn't get lost in a shuffle of a lot more material. Last reason why you weigh is because it's a pathway to engaging better on other teams and also just improving your debate knowledge a lot better, right? Because for one, in terms of engagement, teams who always just respond to each other or try to disprove each other's arguments, the debate will become samey, right? There's only so many structural reasons you can use to prove an argument or disprove an argument. And so sometimes, or to disprove a characterization, etc. And so at a certain point, you need to just concede, right? Like, yeah, maybe they did prove that this argument is true. Especially if you think the judge is, or the vibes of the debate, or simply in the opening exchange, your team has lost that, your team has lost the second exchange as well. It's just impossible at that point to try to win every issue, to win every argument, or disprove or rebut every argument. So at a certain point, you need to start conceding some impacts and then just proving why your own impacts are more important than theirs, right? This is usually my comment as a judge to all debaters, whether it's in college or in high school. And that's, yeah, they don't evolve their case enough.
I think Riv lagged. I will message Riv.
Hello, I think the dorm internet died. Am I back?
Yep, you're back.
Okay. So my slides are loading back up, but while that's happening, yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that sure, maybe your case might be based entirely around responses. Maybe responses are enough to win the debate, right? But it's an important skill for high-level rooms to be capable of weighing. So even in rounds where you can win by disproving the likelihood of the other team's arguments and rebutting them, you should still try to weigh because it helps extend the margin. It helps make your speech stand out more so that it adds value to the round and doesn't just become a regurgitation of previous speakers that makes your whole team look worse than it actually is. And so it's good for speaker points, it's good for your own skills, it's good for the debate getting better, right? Okay. When do you weigh? Okay, so I think this is also important because some teams, well, as much as I said earlier that some teams don't weigh at all or don't weigh enough, I think that some teams are so reliant on weighing, and these are the teams that are frequently accused of uh, listing a shopping list of benefits rather than proving their arguments, right? And that's a very popular call out that judges just believe, oh, yes, yes, oh, I'll disregard all the material because it's a shopping list of impact. So before you weigh, um, there are a few things you need to do first, obviously. So it's very simple. Like, be sure you build the argument completely. If the argument needs a lot of setup at the start, take your time and do the setup, right? Too frequently do teams make a heartfelt introduction about a topic, right? Which is basically hinting at the facts, right? So poverty is a big issue, gender inequality is a big issue. You're basically setting the debate up for the impact you're going to weigh, right? But obviously, if you can't tie your argument to that, if the debate is not set up properly, um, to prove the context or the structural context or the mutual exclusivity of your benefits, and there's no point to weighing. So be sure that you finish building the argument. And don't be the kind of speaker that concedes arguments too easily, right? So I think very smart debaters go immediately to weighing, which is good, right? It's better than not being aware of weighing or being very uncharitable and unwilling to engage, right? But all of the stuff that Alex taught you, that should come first, right? Before you outweigh the other team's argument, which is basically conceding to them immediately that the argument is true. You need to decide what are arguments that I can actually outweigh, right? Like there are some arguments that are pretty damn hard to outweigh. Like if your argument is about the economy, and their argument is about human rights, it's pretty hard to outweigh human rights with economy, right? In most instances. So those are the kinds of arguments you should try to directly respond to. Directly respond to arguments about human rights saying, no, your side doesn't protect human rights better, or we can co-opt human rights. And then you can say, in the case, this is how we outweigh their marginal benefits to human rights with our own material. Okay? So weighing has its place. It's definitely, an advanced thing to do in a round. Obviously, without arguments, without.
I think we're lagged again. I will message you.
Sorry, hello. What's the last thing I said?
Riv is back.
Hello. What's the last thing I said? No? Okay. I will just assume that I got caught off saying that, yeah, obviously arguments and rebuttals are more key to winning the debate. But in a current meta, to go far or to break or to get to out rounds, you need to also do weight after you've built the argument and after you've launched some initial responses. I will say though that definitely it is more strategic before building your third or fourth argument or your extension as a deputy. You should probably just weigh your first argument better, right? And that's not to say that first speakers should immediately have the weighing, especially in Asian Parliament. Like it is definitely the norm to have the first speaker have one or two arguments at least. But before having that third argument, you need to stop and make the judge know why your first two arguments are relevant. Because those are probably the best built arguments that your deputy will go back to when it comes to rebuilding, etc. And at the same time, I think that there's no dichotomy between choosing to weigh and running a lot of material. Usually, if once you get better and better at weighing, it takes less and less time to weigh because the way that you construct the argument already makes its impact sound important. By the way that you set up the debate or give the context on what is wrong with the world, weighing becomes very easy and intuitive because you're already setting up what the problems are in the world that makes your argument seem very relevant. Okay, so weigh before you spam material and get time efficient at weighing so that you can also build material while weighing. Now, what exact arguments, right? Argument selection, like I said a while ago. Sometimes it's just, some arguments are just too hard to weigh against. What are other conditions for choosing how you weigh arguments? So for one, in prep time, as you get better, you should have a bit of time at least for what the other team will run, right? And what you might respond to it at deputy or at leader of opposition. And so some arguments you should try to co-opt, especially the easy ones. Like, usually there's no debate where human rights is completely only for one side. There's barely any debate where economic benefit can only happen on one or the other side. So you should try to co-opt those kinds of benefits. But there are some arguments where there's a very clear trade-off in the motion. Like, for example, this house prefers X to Y, right? Like Y often has, very clear benefits. X has clear benefits, right? So for the arguments that you'll probably have to concede, prep one or two responses as to why the other team doesn't really get that argument or doesn't really win this issue, but already be ready to weigh out why that issue is not that important, right? For example, why is accessibility okay? Is it back? Okay. I just judge when it's back based on when my video starts moving again. But basically, for example, there are some values you can weigh out in a debate, such as accessibility, maybe things like accountability before practical efficiency, etc. Those are the kinds of arguments where usually by the virtue of the motion it's set up, it's hard for one team to really fight for it. So you're just wasting your time if you really try to win that argument on the losing side. So those are the issues or arguments you should weigh against and have that prepared ever since prep. You shouldn't have to think of it on the fly at the last moment when the other team has painstakingly beaten you on that issue. And secondly, the arguments that you choose to weigh should be the ones that you also know that you can really prove are exclusive to your side, right? Stuff that's inherent in the motion, stuff that you have more matter on or more structural reasons for, right? Those are the arguments you should weigh. This is the other arguments which you're kind of running just so you can contest a certain issue, but you don't think it's the most advantageous. Okay, so this gets rid of the threat that I said earlier. You waste so much time with a 3-minute intro about a certain argument or the importance of a certain value, only for the other team to co-opt it in their first minute, right? You should select the material that you dedicate more weight. Okay, quick example. Incorporating all of the tips I just said, right? So you weigh after argument is built, after direct response. So here's a sample, sample LO speech. You obviously clarify your stance, do responses to Prime Minister, trying to disprove their arguments first. Then you interject with your own argument, impact it in of itself. Just very quickly, again, the distinction is that an impact is self-contained, makes the argument seem relevant on its own, versus way in which you compare it to another argument or compare it to the problems in the world and how well it is at solving those problems. And it's at that point that you weigh that first argument, right? Especially if you're LO, you should probably do a bit of weighing because the judge might be biased to the issues that government set up. So it's good when you not only disprove their argument and its importance, that after you build your own argument, your own constructive, you also remind the judge why it is relevant. So they care more about your frame of the world, the impacts you're championing versus government. Okay. For me, I'm the type of speaker to prioritize this weighing before the second argument. But maybe you might want, based on your own style, to run 2 arguments first and then do the weighing. But it's generally good. Make sure you don't have time in your speech before you weigh, because oftentimes when people try to run a lot of material, it's usually 2 half-baked arguments with incomplete weighing. And that is a lot less strategic than 1 argument with really good weighing. Okay, this is just a new thing. I think speakers like Luigi sometimes choose to weigh before the analysis, before proving the likelihood of your argument. So how do I see this, right? Does this go against what I just said? Not necessarily, because you're preloading the weighing, right? His rationale for it is when you say the weighing to the judge first, it makes them care about the argument so that they listen to your middle analysis. They listen to your structural reasons that prove the analysis. So the way I see it, that's valid, but make sure that you don't use spamming impacts and weighing before the analysis to cover up your lack of analysis, because smart teams will always call that out. Make sure that whether you do it at the start of your speech or at the end of your speech after the weighing, you complete middle analysis and you really prove that your argument is true. All right. Any questions before we proceed? So I think it's been a lot so far. Pause for like a minute. Okay. Feel free lang to PM as I go along, and then I'll organically answer it throughout the lecture. So let's actually talk about how to weigh, the most important part. And I'm going to start with a cop-out by saying you need to be, okay. So the reason why debates happen and why motions are balanced is because there is no objective or scientific way to prove that one argument is more important than another. It's all about persuasion and how you make the judge see different values within the debate. At least that's the case for all debatable and well-constructed motion. So usually it's in weighing that most of the innovation happens within debate, right? Some of the speakers I admire the most of all time were the ones who invent creative new ways to weigh arguments and view debates, because there's only so much matter in the world to use for constructing arguments, right? That's just beholden to facts, right? There's only so many responses you can give, which is based on, breaking apart. There's only so many flaws you can find in another opponent's logic, right? But changing how people see different arguments and values is a thing. So for example, I think before 2019, informed consent was like a silver bullet argument, right? As long as one team protects the right to choose or protects informed consent, then that team wins, right? And it's usually done with a weighing that says you do not have epistemic access to what people value the most and what will improve people's lives the most. So we should just allow people to choose. When they have maximum ability to choose, then that is when they can choose what is most impactful for them, and what they choose will naturally be what is more impactful, right? So that used to be just such a simple argument that no one contested until some debaters around 2019, 2018 started injecting these arguments na, is consent and choice really such big of a value, right? That may sound really bad, but why? Why? How is their creative way of approaching it? The first way they approach it is by saying, you can never really have true informed consent or true choice, right? Because one, you are born with a certain immutable traits like your intelligence, physical stature, your race, that you cannot change, right? And so that already limits your access to optionality, to a certain extent. Then add on the fact that you're a product of your upbringing, right? So nature plus nurture, the way that your parents raise you, the cultural circumstances like poverty, like what is acceptable in your country, that influence the way that you act, right? And so no one really chooses or consents to the situations they're ever born into. So at least a marginal amount of consent is not really that valuable versus other values that you might see in the debate. Don't get me wrong. Of course, out of context, it sounds horrible. Like, obviously, informed consent is important. It's an important argument. And before it happens to someone, it's important that they consent to it as much as possible. But these are very specific and nuanced philosophical debates about maximizing choice or maximizing human freedom. And it demands a trade-off, and it demands creative ways on seeing values like consent when it's basically hand gifted to one side of the debate, right? So you can't just lay down and die or hopelessly try to prove that your side improves the right to choose better than the other. Sometimes you have to be creative on how you you weigh that value as less important than your own. But of course, that's a cop out. I can't just tell you to be creative. Here are some examples and cookie cutter metrics that you can use to weigh arguments. So first, we talk about content-based weighing, the first type of weighing I told you about earlier. One basic way to do that is on the scale of the impact, right? How many people does it help? How many um, how many dollars does it generate, right? How many lives does it save? Um, or it can be more advanced things such as education may start and only impact a few hundred people, a few privileged people benefit from education, but that education translates to bigger benefits down the line, right? It means that they become experts that can work in sophisticated industries. They can develop your economy. They can become role models to other people who want to study. That creates this trend of upskilling and people escaping low class labor to improve the economy and their own lives, right? So scale of impact, very intuitive way to weigh, right? Like my argument is more important because it does more benefit. The opposite of this, however, is to weigh based on the vulnerability of stakeholders. And sometimes the bigger impact also goes to the more vulnerable stakeholders. But oftentimes when you have minorities, obviously there are minorities, so the scale of the number of people benefited is lower. But when they're more vulnerable, when they're more urgently dependent on the motion, where they are the only ones, like the only way to help them is through the motion, and other stakeholders can probably benefit elsewhere. That's why our importance is more important. Our argument is more important because it benefits the most vulnerable stakeholders. Next, long-term versus short-term. And I think, some teams immediately gravitate to long-term weighing and saying that, yes, their argument has harms or benefits, but that only exists in the short term. Eventually, those benefits become unsustainable because it's just not profitable. Those harms go away because once society has adjusted to the birthing pains of their argument, then their issue is not a problem anymore. It's a short-term harm. So long-term is a very intuitive way to kind of hand wave na parang, yes, we take the trade-off. Our argument has harms in the short term. There's backlash. There's high amounts of cost. There's an economic downturn, but it pays off in the end, right? It's just an investment. That's very intuitive. But I want to emphasize that you can also weigh on the short term, right? You can prove that our short-term harm or benefit is so crucial that it's important to reach the long term and to begin with, right? Like you can't reach a long term arguments don't matter if everyone dies or everyone starves in the short term. And that's low hanging weighing that's kind of getting forgotten. Like the short term matters also. Lastly is extent. And what this means is, sure, the other team claims the value of privacy, but by how much do they improve privacy, right? Like if privacy is already violated so much, what's a small additional amount of privacy going to do? Versus maybe a small argument like, yeah, it's just economic benefit versus privacy, which might be more existentially important. But when it's such a big profit incentive that really improves the quality of lives of people, maybe trading off privacy is worth it. Like for example, intellectual property, right? Like intellectual property is important. People have a right to what they think about. But what about life-saving drugs? Like, does the person who invents the cure to cancer have a right to patent it and make it more expensive? Or is the social good to humanity really more important, right? So that's an extent of a small profit incentive versus a big social benefit as an example of debating on extents. Okay, I've got another question, but I think it's more strategic to talk about this first. So really quickly, other cookie cutter ways or metrics to do meta-based weighing. Deadlocks. So one is to say we have successfully disproved that this other issue can be credited to the other team. At best, this one clash in the debate is deadlocked. Neither side can prove it. And so our argument is the most important simply because it's the only argument left standing. It's the argument that receives no response, or it's the argument that was easiest to prove, like it's uncontestable, right? Like whereas other arguments are having their likelihoods or the truth contested, or whether it can be co-opted contested. It's just a very messy issue. Our issue is very clear in the short. Second is likelihood analysis. Likelihood analysis is similar to this, But it's different in that likelihood analysis concedes that an argument is important or an issue is important, but it's simply unattainable, right? Like it's simply impossible for one team to prove because it's just too hard of an issue to unpack, or there's just too many barriers to it, right? So since my argument is a lot more likely to accrue to begin with, even if your impacts are bigger, it doesn't matter. My argument is assured. Next, principles versus pragmatics. Again, like short-term versus long-term, this goes both ways. You can say that principles matter independent of pragmatics. Why? Simply because of like humanity, right? Like I think some speakers nowadays struggle on weighing principles, or they always connect their principle to a pragmatic. Obviously, as I said earlier, it's very easy to weigh that a pragmatic benefit that helps a lot of people is important. But don't forget that not all people are utilitarian, right? Like if all we wanted was to maximize utility or pragmatic benefit, then some states would still have slavery, right? Because it's more cheap to produce goods for that, right? Obviously, there are some existential human rights that matter more than pragmatic outcomes, right? Like child labors might be good for the economy, right? Unpaid labor, but obviously you wouldn't do that because that's just a disrespect of humanity. And so a team that goes way too far in on pragmatics, you can always kind of reality check them by saying, no, humanity has principles, right? There are some harms that are just too egregious to do, regardless of pragmatic benefit. Lastly, co-opting. As I said, like parang we can share some of your benefits, or we can have your benefits to your policy. We can have the benefits that op wants with a different policy or with a less radical policy, or status quo is already reaching those benefits, right? Compared to our arguments, which is mutually exclusive, and they haven't made an attempt to even prove why they can also share our argument, right? And as long as you prove your argument's important, then the ability to co-op matters a lot. Okay, I've saved a bit of time for an exercise, just a really quick one that everyone can participate in. You can do recitation for that. But before that, I want to entertain questions, and I'll start by answering the question that I've received in the chat. So, it reads, can you gaslight the judge into thinking your arguments weigh more than your opponents, or is it not advisable? Just a thought, because my insti keeps calling me the master of gaslighting. Oh no. So I don't know what you mean by gaslighting in the context of debate, right? Because unless you're like lying, right? Like there is just a proven fact and you're putting false matter in the round. I don't think there is such a thing as gaslighting. Because yeah, you can weigh any argument as more important than another argument. That's not gaslighting. Obviously, like when you do unrealistic forms of weighing, where you act like an argument is more important than another, it's clearly not, right? Like the other team will do their own counter weighing, which balances out. But yeah, you don't have to worry about gaslighting the judge unless you're just lying na parang the opposing team never said this, or they never mechanized this, but the other team really did mechanize this, right? Like that is gaslighting. Don't do that. Maybe be punitive, but not dismissive, right? But yeah, other than that, I don't think there's any forms of weighing that count as gaslighting. Okay, so I hope that answers the question. So just avoid weak weighing. Just avoid unrealistic weighing na parang, yes, what's this? Increasing people's access to entertainment is more important than the war or whatever, something like that. That's just bad weighing, not gaslight. Okay. So the exercise that I have is just a simple example of weighing, right? So here's a scenario for everyone. The motion reads, it's a simple education motion. All educational institutions should be required to provide students with online attendance options, even after COVID-19, right? So basically online education, asynchronous learning, things like that. or maybe not necessarily asynchronous learning. All it says is online attendance, right? And the argument that I want everyone to weigh against is basically just the argument about quality of education, right? I say you can choose any argument from any side because in this debate, both sides can argue that quality of education improves, either online or on site. Maybe there is a bias to lecture quality on site, but online you also have more access of repository, more free time. So just assume that an argument like this might get deadlocked in the debate. Both sides will try to prove they get better quality of education. The judge doesn't know who to give it. So I want people to think of any other argument that is applicable in this debate and use it to outweigh the argument of the quality of education. So the way you do it is basically say, our argument is more important than ensuring quality of education because XYZ, right? Or this issue is more important than quality of education because XYZ. Okay. So I guess I can just give like 3 minutes for this. At that point, people can just raise their hands if they have anything to share. I can give my insights as well.
Guys, if you're too shy to PM Riv, the same as the lecture earlier, you guys can PM me in the ADS Zoom account and I will read it without saying your name, so it can be anonymous. Yeah.
Okay, so the 3 minutes are up. If anyone wants to go ahead, they can. Does anyone want to give either in the chat or unmuting? And if people want to preload questions in the meantime also, that they can. Come on, guys. Education motion. I'm sure we all have thoughts on this. I'm sure we all have days where we just want to attend school online No one? I'm gonna start giving random arguments and weighing them. No one. Yeah. Okay, I'll exclude the easiest argument, which someone might, risk like mention later on. Feel free to just raise your hand and give your weighing also. But one simple one is just like this is pretty unfeasible to an extent, I guess. So it's definitely a consideration. Can schools really support this or sustain creating both synchronous and asynchronous material, creating online infrastructure, which probably assumes that you can zoom the lecture that's happening on site, but obviously assessments will have to be designed differently, and so you can weigh that um, the immediate quality of education matters less, right? Assuming that op argues, oh no, online actually improves education. Simply because if it's not feasible to run these educational models, schools shut down, they struggle, they lose out on capital for other resources, such as improving their physical facilities. Those don't get maintained. The on site schooling experience suffers. And that also harms not just well-being of students, but it also harms quality of education. So parang, this is the wing I was talking about, which involves co-opting the other benefits, talking about long-term impacts or scale of the benefits, stuff like that. Anyone, please, guys, please, anything, any attempt. It would be a learning experience, like a good learning exercise. If we could discuss how someone brings up a different argument. Okay, well, so I don't want to extend naman or give Clars stress. So I guess the low hanging, oh wait, ito, meron na, perfect. So, okay, the first argument here is that online attendance options weaken students' incentives to resort and make effort to learn, and access the actual privilege to go to school, thus the likelihood of better education is lessened. Okay, so the weighing comes after this, but I think there's already some implicit weighing there, saying like the likelihood of better quality education is lessened. So there, you're trying to co-opt that people don't really access the benefit of quality of education. So quality of education doesn't matter because if students are not motivated to make an effort to learn, then obviously the quality of education doesn't even matter. The students won't make the most of it. So the weighing that they added is that extent a better quality of education is limited to the other side because education is accessible, but don't actually push through personal obligations of students. Okay, so yeah, basically that makes sense. So accessibility comes at the trade-off of quality of education, the student experience, not just the quality of education, the student experience that really motivates people to try hard in school. Okay, that's good. Yeah, still cooking, but you did cook already. Very good. The next one, if OO runs better quality of education, I would run that it's not about better quality of education, but about how students process information because they have to go to different places, and the subjects that are likely to be async are not hard. Okay, so basically, they're saying here that the quality of students is better because it's a lot easier to process information when you go to different places, and things like that. The subjects, for example, that matter with being async are not really that hard. So the subjects that would benefit maybe from or could survive in a online setup aren't really the most urgent. Okay, so there's many layers here. I think it's very good that there are many levels of weighing, and they're all valid, right? The next step, I guess, then would be to structuring weighing, right? Like, you know, you have three levels of response. You can also have three levels of weighing. So the first the first reason why our argument is more important than quality of education is because of, you know, the trade-off, right? Or parang what you sacrifice, which is that the motivation of students. Motivation of students is more important because what's it? Co-optability, right? So that's the one impact that cannot be co-opted, as I said earlier. You can also just do the scale of impact, right? So you can talk about how accessibility to students impacts the number of students that can be helped. And then when you're talking about motivating students, parang the scale of impact, motivation impacts all other parts of the student's life. It impacts their happiness. It impacts their motivation. I mean, like how they absorb knowledge. It impacts their social lives. And school institutions are not always just about information. Things like that, right? So essentially, I think people are all going in the right direction. Just make sure you structure weighing and make it as clear as possible, right? Package it as clearly as possible to the judges, especially when you have different levels of weighing, because you know if it's appreciated, it seems much stronger, you know, when it's clearly divided to different levels of weighing, and they themselves can become individual paths to victory rather than just being one blob of weighing, right? So, uh, as Alex said earlier, if you have any questions, you can just send it to Clara. I will try to get back to you. I hope people learn stuff, and best of luck in all debates in the future.
Yay, everyone say thank you, Riv. Let's show Riv some love, guys. Heart reacts. Para we can also see that you guys are not AFK kasi may isa pang lecture. Slay, you guys are here. Okay, so for the third and last lecture of the day, we're gonna be learning about rebuilding, which is an underrated way of engaging, and it's gonna be by Pio. So everyone say hi, Pio.
Hello, hello. First, can you present? Thank you. Okay. I hope everyone can see the slides. So as was already mentioned, this lecture is going to be about rebuilding. And I think we can go to the next slide. Yeah. So let's just outline the talk. Firstly, I'm just going to define what rebuilding is so everyone is on the same page about what we're actually talking about. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the importance of rebuilding and why you ought to do it or why you ought to practice the skill over time. The third is when you specifically rebuild, and this is also a short discussion about how you ought to approach prep. And then the last is what to rebuild or like how do you rebuild, what to avoid, and what to practice. Um, there's also a link, as you can see, and I will also type it in chat. And this link will direct you to a Google form where you can anonymously submit questions you may have. Feel free to type out the questions you have in this Google form or even in like Zoom private chat, whichever you prefer throughout the lecture. We will get to it later on when we are done with the discussion. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so first question is what is rebuilding? Next slide. Broadly, I think rebuilding is any addition that you may add to what already came from your teammates and the case that has already come from your previous speaker. And more specifically, I think rebuilding can look like one of three things or all three things at once or any mix of them. The first is it's responding to the responses made to your case. So the context here is that naturally, when speakers are engaging with one another, people tend to throw responses and rebuttals to whatever material that you may have posited from your previous speakers. So one way to rebuild the case is to show why those responses might not necessarily be true or might not be more valuable in the grander context of the round. The second is to strengthen the frame and analysis from your teammates, or broadly, this looks into generally making the argumentation that comes from your team a lot more robust. So the examples or the words I use here are the frame and the analysis. So this looks like a lot of the context that underlies the arguments that you make, or it looks like the specific steps you take that show to you or show to the judge in particular why the premise for the claims that you make are connected to the motion, for example, or are connected to certain parts of your frame, or ultimately just connected to the impacts that you want to achieve in your debate. But other than improving the frame and analysis, I think broadly, this can also just look like additional constructive for your team and like additional pieces that you add to the arguments that you are making. Lastly, it is explicitly weighing your material to the material of other teams. So the difference with the previous two is that, for example, when you add constructive to your material, or when you add constructive to your arguments, this looks more like you inherently showing why your argument is important or showing why your argument is true. Or when you respond to other people's responses to your case, it's proving why these aren't true as well. I think the difference with weighing is that it tends to show why in the broader context of the round, why your material, maybe at its best or even at its worst, is necessarily much better or like comparatively better with regards to the material that comes from other teams, whether this is your direct opposition in a 3v3 format or against other teams, like both your closing and like your direct engagement in like DP. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so what is the importance of rebuilding? Next slide. So broadly, I think it is three things. The first is, as we already like implied, it's necessary for strengthening a lot of your argumentation. So I think it's best that we all like acknowledge that in most instances we can't get an argument out perfectly just from one speaker alone, or sometimes an argument itself has to contend with several responses from other teams, or other times arguments just don't come off as clear as we would want them to be. Regardless of the circumstance, usually rebuilding is very important to fix a lot of these gaps in your case and fix a lot of these like holes when it comes to your team to overall just make it like make your argument a lot more robust and a lot more convincing. I think the second is that it also helps you position yourself within a round by allowing you to engage with the material of other teams. So if you recall what we just discussed about what rebuilding can look like, which is responses, adding constructive and weighing. Oftentimes responses and weighing, especially like when you keep these things explicit, allows you to also show to the judge that you aren't debating in a vacuum. And the reason why that's important is because it also shows why your material necessarily trumps over the material of other teams. And this becomes especially important when maybe the values that both teams are defending are seemingly equally important, or other times when you believe that the analysis from both teams is very sufficient. I think being able to engage with the material of other teams also allows you to hedge against like judges maybe not voting for you, or judges maybe not giving you as much credit because they don't feel as if you're able to sufficiently like show why your material is better. I think the last is also it's very persuasive to judges in a few ways. I think the first is that broadly, when you are explicit with things like responses or explicit with things like weighing, it tends to make the life of the judge a lot easier in their eyes, wherein when they look back at their notes, they can see that you directly responded to XYZ claims from your opponent, or that you directly prove why your material is necessarily more important than what comes from other teams. I think it is like that process of making it easier for the judges to look back on their material and see why your team is valuable that also makes it a lot easier and a lot more likely for them to vote for you. I think the second is also that it again does show a lot of what we just discussed, which is that it shows that you aren't existing in a vacuum, or that your material itself isn't just inherently valuable, but valuable comparative to the material that comes from your teams. So let's move on to the next slide. The question is, when do you rebuild? So next slide. Yeah. I think the first thing that I want to clarify is that the process of rebuilding shouldn't be an entirely reactive measure or shouldn't only come out during the round, which is that we've already established so far that rebuilding is a way by which you keep your case relevant by adding responses or by filling in the gaps in your mechanisms or even just like comparing your case to other teams. I think it is important as well, or equally important, that even prior to the round beginning, a lot of the energy that you have and a lot of the thought that you give into making the case already goes into prep. So I think generally it's important that even from prep alone, you don't just build arguments for the sake of building arguments. I think you need to be very thorough in the process of doing this. So it goes to say, like, you should ask questions about what the debate actually looks like. You should ask questions about what you are specifically talking about or what the nuance of the motion may be. It helps to ask what you can or cannot argue for in the context of the round, or at the very least, what is more strategic for you to prioritize. I think a lot of these questions should be asked at the beginning of the prep because they also set a stronger foundation for the arguments that you will end up running. And I think broadly it does a few things. The first is that I think it helps to give you a stronger understanding of what your case actually looks like and what your case seeks out to achieve. And what that means is that in the instance where you have to respond to a lot of material from your opponents, it becomes a lot easier to then fill in the gaps that they may have poked into your case. The second is that it also makes it a lot clearer how you ought to weigh in the context of the round, because at the point where you are better able to understand the value of your case prep alone, I think it firstly makes it easier for you to also directly weigh it at the point where you're already debating and already competing. But secondly, it also allows you to divert your energy into other things, be it focusing on responses that you may not have been able to actually prepare for. So responses that you did not anticipate whatsoever, or maybe it allows you to also focus on evolving the case in many ways, whether that is having a more thorough and more robust mechanism that goes down the line or that is built down the line by your second speaker, or maybe it is like other additional metrics that you employ for weighing your case that allows it to be valuable across multiple perspectives as opposed to it solely being valuable and maybe 1 to 2 metrics we're able to discuss in prep. I think the freedom that you are able to gain and the time that you're able to gain from already having a strong foundation and strong understanding of your case from prep alone tends to be very helpful in also allowing you to adjust throughout the round. But personally, this is the second point now. I think rebuilding tends to be done by second speakers, or in the context of 3v3s, I think rebuilding tends to be done by both the deputy and the whip. And I think that's necessarily just because of the nature of like the term or just the nature of the the skill, which is that you are rebuilding. So first speakers tend to prioritize getting the foundation of the constructive outcome of their speeches, where it's obviously you set up the frame or you set up a lot of the context that goes into your arguments. I think it's where second speakers then come in, or the place where second speakers come in is to firstly add onto that constructive and add onto that frame, but also get into the nitty-gritty details of the case that might not always have the most time allotted to them by like for the first speaker. So let's move on to the next slide. Yeah. And like, how do you rebuild? So I think there's a few things that I want to discuss here. I think we can go to the next slide. Okay, hold on. Okay, yeah, next slide. So the first thing I want to discuss about how you ought to rebuild is what you currently see on the slide. So this is what I've already mentioned, but let's just go through them point by point. I think the first thing that I want you to, I think the first thing that you ought to do or that you ought to practice when you're trying to learn rebuilding is that you should firstly understand the case that you are trying to do. So I think most of the time, what we tend to do when it comes to making arguments during prep is that we tend to gravitate towards a big impact or something that sounds really good for you to say. But what happens oftentimes, which is a habit that I think we ought to correct or ought to, lessen a little bit, is that in prioritizing the impacts that we want to run, we often forget to go through the very process of constructing what the debate looks like. And we often forget the finer details that are oftentimes very important in making the case a lot more salient and a lot less assertive. So the first point of advice here is to really just like take the time and prep. Obviously, I think there has to be some balance that you strike between like managing your time and also like fleshing out the material that you're trying to explore. But ultimately, I think it is worth it to take the time and prep to simply go through a step by step, or at least just go through a thorough process of understanding how a certain piece of context that you might be like knowledgeable about with regards to the motion is then able to bring you to the impacts that you want to argue, as opposed to going from point A to point Z immediately. I think going through each individual point tends to make it a lot easier for you to come off as like reasonable and a lot more believable to the judge. The second thing that I want to talk about is that for rebuilding, I think you ought to listen to the round as it happens. And admittedly, I think this is a difficult skill at times to practice, but ultimately, I think a lot of like a lot of good debating tends to spring from you having the ability to listen to the round and understand what is actually going on. Because what tends to happen is that what we build as a habit oftentimes is that we simply focus on writing down our case instead of really understanding what the opponent is saying. And the way that tends to negatively affect your speech or the quality of like your arguments, for example, is that for one, I think the responses themselves are a lot more at risk of not actually being very targeted. And what that means is that the responses that you are making tend not to highlight or tend not to tackle the crux of what your opponent is saying. I think the second is that when it comes to your weighing, it also becomes a lot less effective because what then happens at the point where you're not entirely aware about what the opponent is saying is that you may try to weigh your case and show that it is more valuable compared to theirs. But what happens is that you are only really comparing your material to maybe a oversimplification of their case or even at times a straw man of what they try to claim. I think the third is that also it tends to make it difficult for you to strategically prioritize what you are going to build in the round. In that, if you are only focused on building your speech as opposed to trying to balance out like listening to the round, what tends to happen is that you might be able to get material that is valuable out in your speech, or you might be able to properly build several arguments that you wanted to build. The problem is that they aren't necessarily what your team needs the most in the context of the debate at the point where you are making your speech. Because it's not always about the arguments that you're able to get out. Sometimes it could be a lot more valuable for you to prioritize like heavy responses at the start of your speech. Other times it might be more important for you to focus on weighing because the judge already somewhat believes the case that you have. The tipping point is whether or not they think the case itself is inherently valuable. I think being able to see the round as it is allows you to clear up the priorities within your speech. I think one way personally that I would advise to like be able to practice listening to the round, I think is two things. I think the first is that for your speech, it might be helpful to try and write down the things you want to say in a way that you would typically take notes, for example, in class, where it's not that you write on full sentences, but rather you write key points that you want to discuss and maybe like certain words that you need to highlight in the way that you want to speak or the way that you want to sound. And I think what that tends to do for me at least is that it also allows me to focus a lot more on what opposition is saying in the round and focus a lot more on what like I need to respond to or what I need to rebuild and weigh in my speech. The third thing that I want to discuss is that you should respond to what the opposition says about your case. So this is what we've already mentioned. I think there are two bad habits that I'll also discuss later that we tend to develop sometimes. The first is that we outright tend to neglect what opposition says about the case. And what that means is that sometimes we only focus on constructive without ever really meaningfully touching upon what opposition says. I think the second is that sometimes we do try to respond to opposition, but the problem is that we are highly dismissive. So you might have experience with other people saying that your case is wrong, that what you say is not true, that your arguments are just outright false, but then they proceed not to elaborate as to why those claims are necessarily true. I think those are bad habits that we tend to develop sometimes. And what that means is that I think when we talk about responding to what opposition says, it looks like responding in a way that is holistic and in a way that is equally thorough to the way by which you approach building arguments, for example. And the next slide, which I'm not going to yet, is going to the next few slides are actually going to talk about how I think I would approach responses. The fourth point that I want to talk about is like filling in the gaps of your teammate's case. But before I talk about that, can I get like a dot in the chat from the participants just to see that like everyone's okay? And if ever like you can tell me to slow down or you can tell me to like focus on a few other things. Yeah. So if there's other questions, feel free to ask them now as well. I will just drink for a bit. Okay. Uh, parang okay naman. That's good. That's good. So yeah, fill in the gaps of your teammate's case. Firstly, what is the bad habit that we tend to develop here? I think sometimes the habit we tend to develop when we try to act as a second speaker is that we tend to simply repeat the case of what our teammates have already said. So I understand that it may come from a point where you believe that the case that you've already constructed in prep is already like sufficient and is already something that you ought to just really push for in the round. But I think but obviously, right, the weakness that comes with simply repeating the case is that one, the case itself does not evolve. And what I mean by that is that the case doesn't change, the case doesn't improve, the case doesn't target like maybe new impacts that might be important, or maybe the case isn't able to incorporate like stronger mechanism that makes it a lot more salient. I think the evolution of the case is one of the biggest responsibilities that come from second speakers. So I think one way to approach it and one way to improve upon being a second speaker that focuses on bringing back the case from your teammates is to simply start by filling in the gaps of your teammates' case. And I'm going to have another discussion about this later on as well as to how you can specifically add to the case. But the point that I want to make here is that instead of simply saying the same lines of constructive or the same lines of like responses or preemptions that may already come from your teammate, what you can do at least as a starting point is to instead look into the holes that may have been poked at your case by opposition, or maybe pieces of mechanism that weren't fully built, or maybe conclusions and maybe context that wasn't very clear coming from your partner's speech. The next thing I want to talk about is just like taking the next step for your analysis. So this is building off what we previously discussed, which is filling in the gaps. So aside from patching up the holes that are poked into your case, I think the next step and the next burden that you have as a second speaker, or just as a constructive speaker in general, I think, is to elevate the analysis as well. So what this looks like is that I think firstly, it's important to recognize that like individual pieces of analysis are limited, I think, in broadly two ways. I think the first is that generally they aren't the most fleshed out. So there are really just limitations to what a first speaker can do and how they can flesh out a mechanism that you are reliant on for your case. So one way to elevate it is to simply add to it as well. So maybe you can flesh out the analysis that you have. Maybe you can be a lot more specific about what certain policies actually look like, a lot more specific about what certain actors are like desperately in need of, or like what certain actors genuinely want to prioritize with their time or their resources. I think the second is to also just generally, like when you take the next step for your analysis, you ought to also ensure that the case is able to hedge against the next step that comes from the responses of your opposition, which is that naturally when you rebuild your case, right, opposition also might have a second speaker that comes after you. Or if you're in BP and let's say you're DLO, then closing halves will follow through with you as well. There are other speakers that are going to come into the debate that are naturally going to try and poke holes back into your case again. So aside from inherently making your like argumentation a lot more reasonable or a lot more realistic, I think the next step as well is to also be more preemptive in many ways with regards to your analysis. So preemptive to the other responses that may come from opposition. And like one way to do that is to make direct preemptions, for example. Or I think generally when you go through the process of like thoroughly building your arguments, they tend to also be preemptive themselves. And then the last thing I want to talk about is just like weighing your contributions. So I think like as like the previous lecture was about weighing, right? So I think this is where you can best employ weighing, which is albeit weighing can be used by any speaker regardless of their position. But I think in the context where you are a second speaker or a speaker that is rebuilding the case of your team, where now both teams or all four teams are contending with like fairly fleshed out arguments, the way you can position yourself in the round sometimes isn't to just keep on adding material and material and material over and over and over. Sometimes it helps to actually just take a step back, look at the broader debate as with regards to how it has unfolded, and then simply compare the material that you have to the material of other teams. Whether that looks like the inherent value of the impacts that you may have, or whether that looks like the steps that you take to prove these impacts. So maybe you can show that you are like more mechanistically reliable than your opening. Or I think in terms of responses as well, like you can show why maybe in terms of extents, your case is ultimately more likely, things like that. Sometimes rebuilding doesn't always have to look like adding like 7 new arguments for 5 new extensions. It could look like taking maybe 1 to 2 minutes just to weigh out your contributions and show why they are valuable relative to the rest of the round. So yeah, I think we can go to the next slide. Okay, so the next few slides are going to talk about responses. I will just drink because I am kind of sick. So the first thing that I want to discuss is how you can approach the structure of your replies or the structure of your responses, wherein I think responses themselves should evolve and shouldn't like stay at one point where it's really just, as you can see in number one, the response is not true. Albeit that is one way for you to start off as a response or start off the process by which you think of a response, which is that you question whether or not an opposition's claim is true. But the way you go from there is to go through the 4 points that I listed here. So you can start by saying the response is not true. But the problem with that is it's not clear. Why is it not true? Maybe you're just saying it's not true for the sake of like seeming like you know what you're talking about, or for the sake of seeming like you are disproving the case of the opponent. But at the end of the day, this is an assertive response, and at best, it is actually just very So one next step that you could take is maybe consider maybe this response is not true because of XYZ examples. So maybe you're talking about IR, or maybe even talking about like local politics. Maybe you can show that certain claims are untrue because you have knowledge about examples where the claim itself isn't inherently true at all, or the claim itself doesn't manifest in the way that opposition wants it to manifest. I think this is somewhat better than the first level of the response, which is to simply say it's untrue, because at least to some extent you're able to provide material that shows maybe in some cases it is untrue. But the caveat there is, as what is implied, is that it is untrue in some cases. So, like, let's say you're maybe talking about authoritarian governments and whether or not they are good. Maybe you can talk about Singapore as an example of how authoritarian leadership might actually be very good for people because it leads to like high amounts of development, like high amounts of like work for people, and just generally Singapore is a very good country. But the limitation to simply using examples is that it doesn't prove why overall or in most cases like the claim that you are responding to is untrue or the claim that you want to prove is true, which is that, and I guess another way to think about it is also just like I might be able to pick out 20 examples, show to you maybe why authoritarian governments are probably the best kind of government and the best kind of governance. But that's 20 examples. What if there are factually maybe 100 examples that disprove the point as well? So, in terms of extents, right, it's not very convincing. The third layer that I would think of, or at least the third level that I think I would go to, is to show um, is to actually look into structural reasons. So you respond to material by saying that the response is not true, maybe because of XYZ structural reasons. So instead of simply relying on examples, right, what you instead look into is reasons why broadly these things might be good or might be bad, for example, that are maybe grounded to the context that you have established, or maybe just like historically true, for example, for the vast majority of cases. I think the difference and the reason why I think this is already a lot better than simply relying on examples or being entirely dismissive is because it firstly isn't dependent on it being true in specific cases. What this shows when you discuss structural reasons as to why a response might not be true or a material coming from your team may be true is because it shows that in general, right, if you assess these things maybe in a vacuum, or if you assess these things maybe in just like the median of cases, they are likely to be true, whether or not like there are some examples that may disprove it or may prove it. But what I think is the limitation to this, even though I think this is already a good point for like people to generally reach, is that if you're able to prove for XYZ reasons why your material is true or why a response is untrue, the way an equally like competent opposition would approach this situation isn't to just say, oh, okay, he proved the response is false, or oh, their material is true. They don't they likely also won't accept the reasons that you give in their entirety. And what that means is that if you give XYZ reasons as to why your claim is true, they will follow it up with ABC reasons as to why their claim is true. And what results from that is oftentimes a deadlock because it's unclear to the judge. Okay, maybe your case is true and it's believable, but their case is also true and believable to some extent. It's unclear which he weighs to be more likely. And because it's unclear which the judge weighs to be more likely, it also becomes a lot more unclear who is going to give the win to, for example. So the way you can break that is to add on to it. So what we have so far is that the response is not true because of XYZ structural reasons. And the way you add to that is to also directly weigh and show why these responses are more likely than the ABC reasons. The first thing that I want to clarify here, right, is that the response at this point in the development isn't a one-liner as it is presented in this slide. Because if you look at the change here, where we say that XYZ is more likely than ABC, it runs into the same problem that we encountered in the first level of development, which is to simply say something is true or something is not true. And what this necessitates from you is that aside from simply establishing that your reasons are more likely, you also ought to add to the response like several considerations that show why maybe your reasons are a lot more likely or your reasons are like more believable compared to opposition. And I think if you go back to the weighing lecture earlier, albeit I'm not too sure what was specifically discussed, I think a simple approach or something that you can practice is use like several weighing metrics that are like several metrics for weighing that currently exist to show why these things may be more likely, or at the very least are a lot more valuable. So that's metrics like scale, metrics like urgency, metrics like likelihood, or metrics like gravity, shanana. All of those things are metrics that you can use at this level of the development that that are not just helpful in showing why your case is likely, but also helpful in showing why your case is like comparatively more believable or more persuasive than opposition. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah, okay. The second thing that I want to discuss with regards to responses is one, firstly, you can ask, like, is the content of the opposition's response exclusive to our side? So one thing that tends to happen, like from time to time, is that your opposition does give like a shopping list of responses to your case. But oftentimes what happens when you give a shopping list of responses, or at the very least in general, right, is that not all of the responses are necessarily exclusive. What do I mean by this, and why is it important that you ask whether or not this is the case? What I mean, firstly, by whether or not something is exclusive is that it means that the harm itself will only manifest on your side or the other side, but never on both, right? That's just like how exclusivity works. The reason it's important is mostly because, or like the reason it's important for you to take this into account and question whether or not this is happening to you is because I think it generally shows that either the response itself and the nature of the response is out of the debate, or in the same way, you can apply it to your arguments, right? Your arguments or your responses to question whether or not the benefits that you may be able to achieve are like the benefits that you may be able to achieve are necessarily exclusive or simply symmetric. In other words, they can manifest on either side to almost equal degrees. I think one example where this tends to happen, maybe in like the local circuit, is like when we talk about like developing countries or when we talk about like local politics, where I think a lot of the times what we tend to discuss is like maybe corruption that exists within their governments or just like a lack of resources. And oftentimes these pieces of framing or pieces of context are oftentimes like thrown out in general and treated as a response by certain teams, even though you can question and can show that oftentimes these are factors that are outside of the debate. The second thing that I want to discuss is that you can question whether or not the response meaningfully targets the core of the material or the argument. And what I mean by this, firstly, is there may be responses from the opposition, but what they might be targeting is maybe just like the smaller parts of your case. So if you imagine your case to maybe be a sandwich, right? The crux of the case can be found in what you use to fill the sandwich, whether that's like cheese or tomato or kahit ano, really. The the thing that I want to target with this point is that sometimes the responses that your case receives tends to only target like external things. So maybe it targets the plate that you put your sandwich on, or maybe it targets the bread. And what I mean with the analogy here is that very simply, the responses that you might hear from time to time tend not to be very targetive of what you are trying to achieve and what you are primarily trying to prove. And the reason then it is important for you to question whether this is the case for the responses that you are hearing is firstly because it gives you very low hanging fruit with regards to the response, right? Which is that it allows you to simply call out the fact that even if the response that they give to you is true at its best case, ultimately it doesn't dismantle the principle that underlies the argument, for example, or it doesn't undermine a lot of the broader pragmatic benefits that you may get from imposing a certain policy, for example. The third thing that I want to discuss is that you question where even if the response is assumed to be true, do its implications outweigh or outvalue the contributions of our material? The first thing that I need to clarify here is when you are most likely to need to do this and when it is most strategic to do this. Albeit, I believe that generally for responses, I think it's good to be generous, where I think sometimes even if you do reasonably try and deconstruct the case of opposition, sometimes it just like helps to also simply engage on their case at its best or engage on their analysis in the instance where it is believably true. So what you do here is not necessarily to concede that their case is true, right? But you do engage on the case where it might be true. And in doing so, you are showing why, even at that point in time, your material is still more valuable. The instances where you're most likely going to need to do this are probably in these situations that we've already talked about earlier, which is where it's a round where a lot of material has been thrown out, or it's a round where the analysis itself is seemingly very equal in quality. And what that means is that it's very unclear for the judge to assess which type of material is more believable than the other because of how tight the discussion has been. So what you can do here then with the even if response is that you assume, and at this point in time, right, you acknowledge that to some extent the analysis is equally believable on both sides, but then show that even at that point, your material is like inherently valuable or like outweighs a lot of the contributions that come from opposition. So again, this is where you call into mind a lot of the metrics that you can use for weighing. So at this point, I think it's a lot more strategic to look into the metrics of weighing that show value of the argument as opposed to like the analysis, which is like likelihood. So again, you can talk about scale, you can talk about gravity, you can talk about urgency, you can even talk about like how connected it is to the nature of the motion. Um, you can talk about like irreversibility or whether or not you can take these things back, all of that. So there are several metrics that you can use and several metrics that like tend to make the even if response very valuable in your material. Next slide. Yeah. So the next thing I want to talk about is adding to the case, right? So the first thing that I want to build off here is the notion that you ought to listen to the round. And what that means is, and the clarification that I want to make here is that when you listen to the round, it isn't simply listening to the material that comes from opposition. Listening to the round also looks like, or at the very least should be, listening to the material that comes from the speakers that come before you. In that, um, I think realistically, right, it isn't always possible that what you are able to discuss in prep, it's what you are like is exactly the same as what you are able to get out in your speech. And what that means is that there are a few questions that you can reasonably ask yourself to see what gaps are actually present in the context of your partner's case, even before you consider the way opposition responses affect the material. So the first question is very simply like, what was rushed, especially towards the end of my partner's case? I think sometimes, and I think maybe several of you have already encountered this before, where you are already at like 650 or like 7, but you still have like maybe 2 impacts you want to run, or like even an entire argument that you weren't able to discuss in your speech, where you tend to like say, for example, like very briefly, I also want to run the second argument that is blah blah blah. So it's in those instances where like your partner has to do those things where you should take note of the parts of the speech that were rushed. The reason why you ought to like obviously focus on that is very simply because if you aren't able to focus on them in your speech, I think for one, it's like material that could have been potentially round winning that isn't really discussed very clearly. I think for two, it tends to leave a lot of low hanging fruit for opposition to generally just dunk on throughout their speeches. So I think it's important to rebuild that as well. And the third is that one philosophy that you might be able to adopt or apply to this situation is that um, in rounds, if it tends to be very valuable for you to have many lines of winning or many cases that allow you to have like many independent paths of victory. So what that means is that even if maybe the first two arguments of your first speaker's speech were not very valuable in the eyes of the judge, if you're able to build maybe a third argument and show why that is actually very valuable, then that gives you more options for you to win the round. And another way to perceive this, or like another perspective on this, is just that aside from having multiple paths to victory, it also means that your opponents tend to have a lot more material that they have to respond to. And the reason why that's important, I believe, is like, again, I think realistically, right, it's not always possible for you to respond to every piece of material that comes from a team. And what that means is that people tend to also prioritize the arguments that they believe are more important. But what happens then is that sometimes maybe those priorities are wrong, or maybe in general they aren't able to fully weigh against all of your material as well. And what that means is that even if like both teams are able to take down like sufficient amount of material from one another, the fact that you might have several more arguments that are still standing and still reasonably salient, right, allows you to have like a greater chance of winning. Um, the second point that I want to like discuss is that you should question what mechanisms or what, or in general, right, like what pieces of framing and like analysis were not able to come out from my partner, or even if these pieces of framing and argumentation were able to come out from your partner, do question whether you think that was clear enough to the judge. So sometimes, right, like again, I think there is it's not always possible for you to like get the case out perfectly. And what happens is that sometimes you miss out on crucial mechanism, or other times the mechanism that you are able to run just was left in the abstract, for example. So it's not very clear what examples make this like, what are the examples of this happening, or what does it actually look like in the real world. I think it is the lack of clarity that tends to be very fatal to teams. So it's also important to consider whether or not the things that you want to include in the case were clear enough. The third thing that I want to talk about is just like, were there gaps between their analysis and their impact? So if you imagine a single argument as maybe a line or maybe a bridge, right? The impact is one end of the bridge, and then the premise is the other. It is the analysis that is able to build the bridge and connect those 2 points. At the point where there is a gap in your analysis, right, then it becomes a lot harder for judges to believe that the impacts that you want to claim are something that they can credit to you. So I think the most important question that you can ask out of all of these is what is generally, were there gaps between the analysis and their impacts, right? So was there something missing in maybe the context that we show that proves why something is very likely from very specific groups, like policymakers? Was there something missing in the analysis that shows why this specific policy or this specific course of action is within the interest of maybe social movements or individual politicians or even like larger countries? It is you being able to listen to the round as it happens, and you being able to identify the gaps that exist within like between the analysis and the impacts of your like partner, that also allows you to like better have an idea of like how to fill in the case. So I'll pause for a bit to drink. Can we do the dot thing again in the chat if everyone understands? If not, feel free to ask questions. Damn. Hamburger. Okay. Yeah, next slide. Okay. How do you specifically add to the case, right? I think there's 5 things that you can do, or generally 4 things that you can do. The first is illustration. This is very powerful, I would say, and I think sometimes people sleep on it, which is just very simply, a lot of debates tend to be very abstract. It's like debates today look like, what do social movements want? Debates today look like developing new technologies that we've never encountered before, the relationships between individual countries, the ways by which religions, for example, or certain narratives influence people. A lot of the examples that I've given right now are examples of motions that you may have already encountered several times throughout your careers. And the commonality between all of them is that they're very abstract. Like if you think about it, I don't actually know what it looks like when a certain like social movement, for example, takes this specific course of action, I don't know what religion specifically does. It affects my personality. It affects how I perceive myself. It affects how I act. I don't understand like what specific technologies actually do. I don't understand what happens in the instance where I support certain narratives. Who are the people that are affected by these things? The first way, and one of the best, and I think what the very least, what is a very good way of adding to the case that you have, is to simply illustrate, show what this looks like. So if you want to talk about an actor, or you want to talk about specific groups of people that are significantly affected by emotion, right? Then illustrate what their life looks like. What do they have to go through day to day? What are the types of like messaging that they experience? What is the content that they consume and how does it affect them? What do they specifically desire? What are the opportunities that are and are not afforded to them? Or how are they specifically targeted by maybe social movements, by government institutions, by religious institutions, even social groups? There are many questions that you should ask, not just to have a better understanding of how the case essentially functions, but also to show and understand what you are actually talking about and what it looks like. And the reason why I think illustration is like, very good is simply because in a lot of rounds where you talk about the abstract, the judge is also grappling to understand what this looks like. So being able to give him that clear image, right, tends to be very, very persuasive to keep you relevant in the round. The second thing is very simply new or improved mechanism. So I think the way you approach this is to like look back at what we talked about in the last slide, which is to look at the gaps of what your partner or what your teammates were able to say. So how do you approach this? The first is the simplest way, which is simply, you know, just like building back what your partner already has, but adding the context that that they were not able to add, or adding the analysis and the mechanisms that they weren't able to talk about, or being a lot clearer in how you discuss these things, so at least you know that the judge understands what you're talking about. The second thing that you can do then, aside from like rebuilding in the most direct way, is to also try and improve these things in many different ways. So one way to improve mechanism is to maybe add framing that shows why this is likely the incentive of certain groups, or why likely you have the resources to do so, why certain outcomes probably are like a lot more likely. Asking the questions that asking questions about what like is happening in the debate also allows you to really add in a lot of the context and a lot of the knowledge that like shows why certain things that you want to run are like likely as well. The third is like new impacts. So maybe you have the same argument, but maybe it's not very clear why the argument is important, right? So let's say like maybe you're talking about development in a debate, and one of the arguments that you're able to run is XYZ policies are able to increase the amount of work that people have, then it's not really clear, right? Or at the very least, some judges don't believe it's clear enough why work is important. So why is work important? Maybe it's because work gives you a salary, and that salary allows you to pay for food for your family. So you're able to keep them fed. Or maybe a salary is important because it also allows you to develop savings or earn savings over time that lets you have financial security down the line. Maybe work is important because that salary allows you to send your kids to school without being entirely dependent on like subsidies, for example. Um, Sometimes what we miss isn't just analysis. Sometimes it's also just like the explicitness of what we're actually trying to achieve. So if that's what's unclear from your partner's case, or if you think there are other benefits that come from a certain argument that weren't discussed, then it's reasonable for you to also add these things to your discussion. The last is new weighing. I think we mentioned this or touched upon this a bit earlier, where I think weighing can be done in many ways. So it's not just like using one metric and thinking, okay, I do this, I show why this is true or why it's more likely, and then you're done. I think weighing, because there are several metrics, means that your weighing should also change throughout the round. So, what is one way this could look like in an actual debate? I think one way this tends to look like is that first speakers in building their arguments already tend to weigh it by showing why the argument is inherently valuable. So maybe you're talking about education. So what your first speaker does is that, like, education is inherently valuable. Um, but the limitation there is that obviously it's not comparative to what maybe opposition will run. So new weighing could look like talking about why this education that you're able to garner, or why the quality of education or the amount of education that you're able to provide is like significantly more important relative to maybe the opposite trade-offs that opposition takes. So maybe you can compare access quality, maybe you can compare likelihood of like graduation to just offering multiple people the ability to study. um I think generally, like, you should be able, like, viewing should look like adding to the discussion, not just by showing why the material is valuable in and of itself, but why the material is valuable relative to other things. Um, the last thing is just like clarity wins rounds. So the point that I want to make here is just that, like, ultimately, I think no matter how you want to approach rebuilding, I think what should be practiced, and I believe this does also extend to first speakers and just debaters in general, is that you ought to be clear. So clarity can look like many things. Maybe it looks like slowing down the way you speak. I know, like, at least some of the kids I've coached tend to be like rapid fire and just keep, shinanana. So that's one way to like become clear, where you slow down. Other times it's being like very precise with your wording. So opting to drop maybe a few words to focus on an example that makes your case clearer. Or sometimes it's just like generally being a lot more direct with the words that you use, as opposed to, using words that might be confusing to the judge. Yeah. Clarity wins rounds, because ultimately, let's say you're in a room where all speakers are equally matched, all of them are equally smart. I think one way to edge against them or edge out against them is to simply make your case a lot more understandable. So really quickly, let's go to the last two slides and then vibes. Yeah, next. Things to avoid. Four things. One, being overly dismissive. We talked about this in the responses. Um, Try to veer away from the habit of simply saying, no, you are wrong. No, this is untrue. No, I don't believe you. Your case is bad. Other than that, leading you down a very bad path of being very mean, I think it is also that being dismissive is not actually persuasive in any way. Judges want to hear responses that meaningfully tackle the material from other teams. At the point where you simply say something is untrue, then that's all they have. Like, if you take the perspective of a judge, right, and what they hear from you is, no, opposition's material is untrue, think of what they're going to be able to do with that line that comes from your speech in deliberations. They'll think, okay, they said it's untrue, they didn't elaborate, so they're more likely to just drop it. The second is tunnel visioning. So I mentioned priorities earlier. Um, I think the reason why, what I mean by priorities here is that sometimes you will also contend with other people that run a shopping list material. What you ought to do is not always to respond to every single case, but to prioritize the cases that are most salient. So those are maybe the cases with the largest impacts, or the cases that are the most well built. It is the prioritization and the selection of the responses that you do run that's important, because I believe like you can usually like save maybe like responses that don't hit the best down the line. So maybe your whip can cover for responses that weren't the most clear. But it's when you are unable to prioritize the material that is most important at the round, where I think you're put most at risk of just like becoming less relevant. Um, I think the third also goes like hand in hand, where it's like targeting the wrong responses. I think what this looks like is also in what you consider for the responses that you are going to run. Because maybe for a single argument, you can have or think of like several responses that you can run. What's important is that you also prioritize the ones that are most effective. So it's okay that maybe you don't always have like a long shopping list of responses for individual arguments. I think what's important is that the responses that you do run are the ones that are most believable. So take a strong response and run it. If there are other responses that you think of you believe aren't equally strong or stronger, then it might be more strategic not to prioritize them at the end of the day. And then the last is to simply repeat the case. I think we've already discussed why this ought not to be done or a habit that we should avoid. Last slide, and then Q&A. First thing is clarity and illustration. So I won't dwell on this any longer. I think it's very like clear. I hope it is clear why you ought to also have clarity in the way you speak, and also just sometimes focus a little bit more on illustration so that your case isn't left in the abstract. I think the second is listening and comprehension. So maybe you are already developing the habit of listening to people in a round because that is also how you've come to learn how to properly respond. But the second thing is also just to make sure that when you do listen, you are comprehending the things people are saying. So it's not just about knowing that they said XYZ, but knowing what XYZ does and what it means in the context of the round. It is knowing the core of what they're talking about that allows you to also make the best responses. The last is being explicit with your weighing and impacts. So it is what it is. Like sometimes there is implicit weighing that comes from just your argument being very good or your argument already like having wording that shows why it is valuable. But other times it's just important to be explicit. Tell the judge, I am going to compare the likelihood of their analysis to the likelihood of ours and show to you why ours is probably the most likely. Even if you don't believe that, I'm also like, or like, even if you don't think that, even if you don't believe that as much, I think you can also then look into like the gravity of like the arguments or the weight that they carry or just the significance of the motion, blah blah blah. Being explicit with your weighing, again, does what I mentioned earlier, which is that oftentimes it makes the life of the judge easy. And because it makes the life of the judge easy, it in short tends to make it a lot easier for them to also defend you in deliberations as well. So yeah, that's it. I guess we can have questions. If none, okay din naman. Because I have a 7 a.m. class tomorrow. Can I also have a dot in the chat to make sure like everyone still like followed through until the end? Thank you. Okay. Um, do we have other questions? Do we have questions? Kasi parang wala naman sa form so far.
Guys, so same as Alex and Riv, you guys can either send through the form that Pia sent, you guys can PM him on Zoom, or if you guys are shy, you can PM the ADS Zoom account and I will read your questions.
I'm just gonna check on a lab report first. But yeah, feel free to send questions. Okay, wait, I have a question. So I'll just read it out loud, but I won't say your name. Can I ask any tips on how to make rebuilding more explicit? since usually rebuilding a second speaker becomes a bit more implicit on my end because I have a lot to say. Uh, I think there's a few things we can try to tackle here. So the first is your issue is you have a lot to say. I understand the feeling that there's a lot of material that you want to get out of your speech, and there's a lot of material that you probably have to balance. I think one thing that maybe you can question is maybe during the speech itself, are you being economical with your wording? That is to say, when you are actually arguing, do you have a tendency to maybe use verbal crutches very repetitively? Or do you have a tendency to use words that have much shorter and much simpler alternatives? Or do you have a tendency to just very simply repeat the same point over and over? I think looking into the way you speak is like one way I think you should like one thing you should consider at the very least, where it's like maybe sometimes the reason it is hard for you to be able to um like be explicit or just generally manage your time in building is because there are controllable things that you do that eat up a lot of time. So what's an example, right? So I think you get what I mean when I say like sometimes we might repeat the things we say over and over. But what about like verbal crutches? So sometimes I think we have a tendency to refer to the chair or the panel or to the judges over and over in their speech. Yung tipong paulit-ulit na talaga na every argument is flagged by referring to them. Or sometimes I think we use like I think sometimes we use like big words. Where I mean I personally also have a bad habit of using big words sometimes, but I recognize that it is something that ought to be corrected. So big words are maybe like um no clue, no clue. I don't know what big words are, but you get it. So that's one. I think the second is to also consider um that maybe the problem or maybe you having a lot to say doesn't always have to conflict with being explicit. Because I get that maybe the concern is that explicitness tends to come from things like illustration and things like examples. But for one, I think you don't always have to like give a shopping list of examples naman talaga. Maybe one or two reasonably explained examples are already sufficient to make the policy a lot clearer. I think other times naman, being explicit doesn't also have to be limited to examples, which is that explicitness can just be like, it could also just look like signposting a lot of what you're going to say. So what that means is that you're just very clear about what you're talking about. So let's say you're talking about responses. What you can do to be very explicit there is, I'm going to do responses. Let's say you've already established you're going to do responses. The first response, or let's and this is an example, right? So what you can say is, for example, the first response to the case about XYZ that comes from opposition is ABC, blah, blah. The second response to their point about XYZ is blah, blah, blah. So just be very clear about what you're actually talking about, as opposed to maybe, as opposed to necessarily just assuming that the judge can track every single thing that you're saying. Sometimes it helps to just also be very clear. Or maybe when it's arguments, right? You can also be clear. So the first argument that I want to run is that this happens. And this happens firstly because people are blank. And because people are blank, they tend to be attribute one and attribute two. And because of that attribute or those attributes, they tend to need A, B, C, and so on and so forth. I think just maybe having a clear structure that you follow for your arguments, which then translates to clear signposting when you speak, tends to help cut down on a lot of the repetitiveness and also allows you to focus a lot more on being explicit. And I guess another thing to add is also just like at that point, right? It might be helpful to maybe outline your speech in many ways so that you know how you are going to flow through every single idea. And remember, another thing that you could try, albeit like this isn't everyone's cup of tea, is that sometimes people do actually block out the amount of time that they spend for their speeches, right? Like, let's say in like maybe 7 minutes, in like 5 minute speeches, for example, like sometimes people block it out as like the first 15 seconds being an intro, and then the next 30 seconds being their responses, and then first 2 minutes is like, argument one, the next time is like argument two, so on and so forth. It might be helpful to try many strategies that allow you to be concise with how you speak, as well as like a lot more precise with your time management. Yeah. Um, if ever you can ask a follow-up question. But there's another question as well. Um, is there an effective way of integrating rebuilding during whip speeches? Usually when I whip, both in AP, I use issue-based here. In BP, I use house to house. It is a bit hard where to place this. So sometimes the speech becomes time inefficient too. Hmm. Well, I think the first thing that I want to ask is like, when you mention your strategy or your approach to whipping, which is like issue-based or house to house, like what do you specifically do? Because what I'm getting is like the priority that you have in your whip speeches is to focus a lot more on responsive material. But I don't know, maybe you have like a different approach. So yeah, maybe I'd ask that clarification first. But from what I understand, and like the general thing that I want to talk about here is like, I think generally, like when you do like for both of the strategies that you use, I think rebuilding does have to be integrated into it in the sense that it's not like they're entirely separate entities, right? So let's say you're in BP, right? And you're going house to house. And if you're and let's say you're closing opposition. So if you go house to house, presumably what you do is like you go from OG and then you go to OO and then you go to CG. Um, one half of what you're going to do for each house that you touch upon is to probably respond to their material, right? But the other half is clearly like not just responding, but also showing why your material is important relative to theirs. So I do believe like it should like it goes hand in hand. That's one. But I think for two, it might be important. It might be good to consider at least experiment wise, right? Like it might be good to experiment and try out not being very strict with the structure that you use for it, which is that sometimes it doesn't have to be like house to house. Sometimes you can tackle maybe opposition bench first and then also compare it to your opening later because I don't know. I do believe like the way you prioritize your arguments in a speech should also depend on what's actually happening in the round, right? Like let's say maybe closing opposition is a lot like is almost very similar to their opening. I think there you can focus more on weighing your case to theirs as opposed to like individual responses to both of their material. Or like let's say you're comparing yourself to your opening, I think there it becomes less about responses, more about like just highlighting what you specifically contribute to the round and how that changes the material that may have come from them or just changes the debate overall. So I guess the way to summarize my thoughts on this matter is like I think for one, the approach for whipping, regardless of like what strategy you're specifically using, should already like include a lot of the rebuilding to begin with, which is that I think whip speeches that tend to be overly responsive aren't always the best. So I think to some extent you do have to cut down on like responses. But like secondly, right, I think the most effective form of response anyway isn't just like pure rebuttal that shows why your opponent is wrong, but usually it's comparative building and like comparative be really comparative of the material that came from your partner and showing why a lot of the analysis that you do does engage with the material that comes from you. I think Alex is peer pressuring me to wrap up. But yeah, I guess we can have one more question. But if none, I think we can also end the session so you guys can also sleep. If ever naman, right? Like firstly, you have the G form, but second, there's the Discord. And then third is also like you can also just message me on Facebook, I guess, or I suppose like yeah, I think there are many platforms naman for you to be able to ask questions if ever they come up later. So if none naman, yeah, thank you guys.
Slay. Thank you so much, Pio. Everyone say thank you, Pio. Let's show Pio some love. React naman dyan.